So here we have a question from Steve Locke on Facebook, and it reads, I was thinking about getting something like a Better Maker EQ plugin and curious as to whether using this and say a mix effects console on the master bus to add some analog juice to my mixes prior to sending off to mastering is a good or bad thing. Now, the kind of the way that I am kind of reading that question is he's asking basically how much effect would it have if I had processing over my mix bus. A mix bus effects processor, something like, let's say, the SSL Fusion, where you've got vintage drive, you've got sort of like saturation, stereo widening, EQ, kind of a soft high frequency compressor. What else is on there? A little roll off, and then an EQ like the Better Maker plugin. Now, when he says a Better Maker plugin, I presume he's talking about the hardware that utilizes a plugin to use its control. That's what I'm kind of thinking he's on about there. So to answer that question, the simplified question is what's the pros and cons to adding mix bus processing over the mix prior to mastering? And most engineers, pretty much every mastering engineer, will tell you, do not put take all your processing off the master bus before sending to mastering. And generally speaking, you don't have to take everything off. All a mastering engineer needs is for you to not limit the dynamics, basically. Do not compress, do not limit, and just generally keep a full dynamic range. And the reason for this is there's many reasons, but the main reason is basically limiting and compression are down the end of the chain. So you do all your EQ, your saturation, everything's done prior to the compressor and the limiter. They're the final stages of a mastering chain. So if, for instance, you've done limiting and compressing on your end, then there's limiting and compression at the start of the chain, and then it's a lot more difficult on our end for mastering to be able to process in the correct order. We basically will always want a full dynamic range, no limiting, no compression. Although I said there no compression, but it's perfectly fine to have a mix bus compressor over your mix. There's nothing wrong with that, just not hard. If the compressor is slammed, that's going to be a problem. If the compressor is subtle, like when I mix, let's say I'm mixing on an SSL console. Whenever I used to mix on my SSL console, I'd have a G bus compressor, and it would always just flick into the G bus, and it would never be smashed. That G bus would never smash, but it was just flicking. It was there more to glue the mix together rather than a mastering compression type of sound. So there's nothing wrong with subtle compression. Limiting, like real hard limiting, is there's issues there because you're physically squashing the track, and that's what we don't want. Just so that we've got a full dynamic range and everything can be put in to the chain in the correct order. If you've got compression at the start, you've already limited all your dynamics, so all your EQ. It doesn't result in a very good sound. Far better results are achieved when there's no limiting and no hard compression. So then you've got things like EQ. EQ, there's nothing wrong with if you want to EQ your mix, just to bring it up to the kind of clarity that you want. There's nothing wrong with that, because that's no different to if you had an EQ on each channel in the mix. and you was to achieve that master bus sound that you were achieving with the EQ that you put over it. So there's nothing wrong with adding an EQ to the master bus, because you can always, the thing with EQ is you can always kind of undo an EQ. So if you've put, a shelf on that's 5 dB shelf, technically speaking, you could put a 5 dB shelf, a subtractive, and reduce it back to 0. Technically speaking, you can. There's not a lot wrong with adding EQ on your end. The problems arise with adding EQ on your end is that if it's done badly, obviously it's better left for us to do, because we can always add it, remove it, whatever we need to do. And that's ultimately what we will do, add what is required of the track. So there's not a problem with you kind of adding an EQ on your end. No issue there if it's to achieve a sound that you want. Ideally, leave it to us, because we will most probably be using better EQs and multiple different EQs in different ways to achieve the right results. But like I say, is if there's a sound that you want to achieve and you want your mix to sound like that, by all means, apply an EQ and achieve that sound. Other things like widening, for instance, if you was to get let's go through the SSL Fusion and just go through the stages of that and what you could apply over your mix. Now, the SSL Fusion is a mix bus tool, for instance. We have one at the start of our mastering chain. So we will always run into that at the start of the mastering chain, and that kind of sets the chain up. Everything kind of flows off of that SSL Fusion. And the reason for that is the SSL Fusion is a mix bus processor. It's an all-in-one kind of tool that has a little bit of everything. And it's a very, very good tool. Now, if we go through the stages of the SSL Fusion, and I'll tell you which ones to leave on, which to leave off, the roll-off. Now, the roll-off from a perspective of mastering, you wouldn't need to use a roll off. You wouldn't need to roll anything off, because we would roll off on our end. There's no real need to roll off the low end. Obviously you can, but ultimately with a roll off is if you've rolled something off too much, it's harder for us to put it back in what's required once you've rolled it off, because you are physically kind of removing that information down there with a roll-off. So roll-off I wouldn't necessarily recommend unless you're doing the roll-off right, and you never really want to go, 30 hertz little tiny roll-off. There's anything more than that, unless it's acoustic music, you really don't need to go that much. But I would honestly say just don't bother with a roll-off. There's no real kind of need for it. Let us do that, because we would be better off doing that, and we'll do it at the correct stage in the chain. Saturation. So you've got saturation on the vintage drive on the Fusion. Now, if we just kind of blanket that with saturation, the thing with saturation, this is something I will say that kind of applies to all processing, is it depends on the saturation and the purpose of it, right? So if you're adding saturation on your end, bear in mind that anything that you're adding on your end, if you're adding it on, let's say with low end, not that a Fusion is low end or anything like that, but a low end kind of saturation, maybe a plugin, for instance. If you're applying saturation using a plugin, now just bear in mind that although you're adding it and kind of creating a sound, we will apply saturation on our end. But the difference is that the application of saturation on our end would be using a Vertigo VSM2 analog hardware, as well as a Whitestone P331, two of like the best saturation units made. They are unbelievably good, and the sound you get from them is so much better than anything you would get in a plug-in game. So we will always apply saturation where required. The thing with saturation is, if you're using it to create a specific sound, now, if it's a creative sound, something that is very much the sound that you want, then by all means apply it. If it's just to create a bit of warmth and body in the track, leave that to us, because we will apply it at the right stage in the master. We will also apply it using analog hardware and two of the best hardware saturators that money can buy. So it's going to sound better on our end. Also, you know, when something's saturated before, we saturate it again, it can get oversaturated. So then you've got an EQ on the SSL Fusion. It's a low shelf and a high shelf, for instance, and there's nothing wrong with adding a bit of low shelf EQ and a high shelf EQ and just giving it a bit of a bump at either end, and bringing it up to where you want it to be. There's nothing wrong with you doing that. We will do that, but if you've done it as well, you know, we might need to go a little bit more, or we might need to dial back on it. Who knows? It depends on what you apply. But it can always be corrected. Whatever the sound is due to an EQ, we can always plus minus EQ and basically correct anything if it's not right on your end, for instance. Yeah, then you've got things like you've got a high frequency compressor, and we will use de-essing on our end at the right stage in the chain. So the things like a de-esser on your end, I would say it's not a necessity, just because we're going to be doing that anyways. It's something you can do if it's just subtle. If it's just, the problem is if it isn't right and you use de-esser, for instance, or a kind of any sort of like massage in the highs, things like soothe brilliant for just kind of controlling that top end. But if you go too hard and suck the life out of the top end, so that when something hits hard and it sucks down too much, that's difficult to rectify in the master, and it's not ideal. So again, it's like we're doing that anyway, so there's no reason for you to do it. But if you're going to do it right, there's no harm in doing it right. Ideally, we would prefer that de-essing was not applied on your end. Now, next in the stage would be widening. Now, the thing with widening, the thing is, you could widen a track. But again, we're going to do that with a process of the Fusion widener, the Portico 2 field editor, stereo field editor, SFE, I think they call it. So we're going to use those two, and we'll also use mid-side EQ with various different EQs. So any widening you do, we would be able to do better and more accurate and more to a tailored sound that is perfect. Widening, I wouldn't say is essential on your end, because it's better for us to increase the width of your song, rather than you increase it maybe too much and then us have to dial it back. It's better for us to get it to where it should be and then enhance it. So in a nutshell, basically, to summarize this, it's going to, the thing is putting those two processors in, a Fusion I think is about 1,700, and then a Better Maker maybe 2,300 for the EQ, something like that, around those prices. So you're talking about $4,000 to put something in that isn't necessary, is not necessary. You don't have to do it. I mean, it's fun to have, it's fun to do, it's fun to put that sort of process in over a mix, even just to get it up to a demo. if I'm honest, I wouldn't even bother with going down the analog route. I don't think you'll gain much. I would just if you want to add processing over the mix, I would say add whatever you want over the mix using plugins, and then what you can do, if that's the case, is then you could just, if you were printing the mix for mastering, you could just bypass anything that you wanted to take off, and that way, instead of hardware, it's a little bit harder to bypass. It's more printed into the file. So with the plugins, you can just bypass whatever ones you wanted to remove. Yeah, and you could even send, 2 different versions to us and say, look, here's one that has all the mix bus processing taken off, and here's another taking on your after watching this video, removing just the compression, just the stereo widening, just the limiting, or maybe I've taken off the saturation, just so you've got the flexibility of being able to add your saturation in a better way. So that's what I would recommend. I would say just use plugins, because you can just bypass whatever you need to bypass. Unless you're going to start adding a full-on mastering chain, I don't really feel that that the kind of analog processing over the mix bus prior to us processing over the mix bus is beneficial for you. If you weren't to be getting it mastered with us, by all means, anything's gonna sound better. But when I take into account that you'd be sending it to us, for instance, for mastering, everything that we've got and would do would always be better than anything that you did. So what I'll say on that point is, anything that you want to do, anything that you want to apply on your end at the mix stage over the mix bus, think of it as only do the creative stuff that kind of achieves a creative sound, or achieves a very specific sound that is tailored to you and the sound that you actually want to achieve over your mix. And then think of our end as, that's my mix, that's with my tailored sound on, and now I'm giving it over to the Audio Animals guys, and they're just going to go boom and make it into this masterpiece that's just kind of going to be uplifting and just kind of lift it off the page. That's what I would recommend. Okay, so I hope this answers your question. If anybody has any more questions, just fire them into the comments, or go into the description on these videos. There's a little link, and you can submit your comment, and I always go through them. And if there's really good, interesting questions that I haven't covered already, I will answer them in video format like this.